I have never once experienced sort of even a moment of burnout when I'm working on a thing that I'm supposed to be working on and that I'm aligned with, even if it's not going well or perfectly as well as it could be. I think where burnout emanates from, at least for me, and I think that spinning your wheels on something that's not working. If I ever feel anxiety, versus stress, like that's almost a sure sign that I'm doing something that's misaligned. The AI Daily Brief started last April and very quickly had an audience, and it was an audience of people who were all kind of going through the same experience of having tried AI, come to the conclusion independently that it was going to likely significantly change how they were working, what they were working on. So I basically copied cable news instead of copying sort of other podcasts, and it worked. It was very sort of successful because it was offering something different.
And you removed yourself from the environment that we were just speaking about, and you went to a completely different part of the world, perhaps as different from Silicon Valley as Spain. Welcome to the Art of Lost and Found podcast, Nathaniel. I'm so happy to have you here today.
I couldn't be happier to be here.
So you and I have a long history. I think the first time that we connected, I was a super fan of your perhaps original, but first one that I know of, blogs about social entrepreneurship. And you had this incredible ability to identify trends and anticipate the sort of changing tides, the trends, the significance of those trends, and then write such captivating pieces. Like, I didn't read any blogs, but I read yours every single time you posted. We had an opportunity to connect, and your energy was just always so generous and so supportive. And you seemed to be a champion for different causes, different people, but did it in a way that felt so true and authentic. So you immediately were endeared to me. And then I've had the privilege of witnessing you through many different iterations of your career. And when I think of somebody who is entrepreneurial, someone who's incredibly intelligent, who knows how to use their mind, and also someone who's creative and resilient, I think of you. So
Amazing.
That's why I invited you.
You've definitely seen a lot of versions of the story, for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to first start with a little bit of introduction. If people aren't familiar with your work, can you share a little bit about who you are and how you're showing up in the world these days?
Yeah. I'm going to try to do, I'll do the now, and then the quickest, like LinkedIn style biography, just because there's so many different touch points that may come up in this conversation that I think might not in some others. So currently, the thing that I am most focused on, I run a company called Super Intelligent, which is a platform that helps people learn how to use AI, generative AI. And that came out of an experience hosting a podcast. I do a daily show on AI called the AI Daily Brief. It used to be called the AI Breakdown. And, we can get into the sort of genesis of it, but the AI Daily Brief started last April and very quickly had an audience. And it was an audience of people who were all kind of going through the same experience of having tried AI, come to the conclusion independently that it was going to likely significantly change how they were working, what they were working on. And they were looking for, sort of more resources to figure out how to actually use it well. And so that was sort of the genesis of Super Intelligent. Now, the AI Daily Brief, the podcast that sort of spawned Super Intelligent, was not the first podcast that I was doing. It was actually a spinoff in some ways of a crypto show called the AI Breakdown, which is a crypto and macroeconomic show that I've been doing since basically late 2019. And before that, sort of, going all the way back, I've had stints as, when we crossed paths, I was deep in the social entrepreneurship scene, which was sort of emerging. The terms that they use now for all this stuff are actually different than the terms we used back then. But basically, there was a whole business for good sort of, renaissance and moment that happened in the 2006, 2007, 2008 period. That's sort of what brought me out to San Francisco, where I lived for a decade before moving back here to New York. So we had a stint in that scene. I was a venture capitalist for a while, focused on ed tech, did various sort of Silicon Valley things, and had a long stint in crypto as well. So have always been in and around technology, have always had some part of sort of content intersecting whatever else I was doing. and have come at sort of business from lots of different angles. From, this is a venture-backed company that's, raised money and is raising more money, to sort of solopreneur type endeavors, to nonprofit things, to content as sort of the main thing, to making Super Bowl ads for a company. So really weird and kind of diverse set of things that, maybe there's some through line, maybe there's not.
I think there's a through line. I see it. That's why I invited you here. It's this concept and this idea of helping bring in future, right? Like, you see things before they happen or as they're happening. You're one of those people that seem to always be on the cutting edge, but you're also, it reminds me of this quote I heard the other day: is strong opinions loosely held.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that, because you were somebody, or are somebody, at least from my perspective, who has these strong opinions around the future. Like, what is coming? What is trending? What is the next thing that's going to, not just a trending thing, but what's the thing that's going to disrupt or change the way that we are experiencing our lives? Like, big ideas, not just money-making opportunities. So it's this concept of these bigger ideas of what's going to usher in the change, but you're doing that through so many different vehicles. But for me, it doesn't seem totally random, at least not from this perspective. I see like some sense of a through line.
The way that I always frame the breakdown, the first podcast that I still do actually every day, but I always say it's about big picture power shifts shaping our world, and that for me has always been the interesting frame of reference. As a history major in college, and I've always been fascinated by things that are the big world shaping, world changing trends, and I think I gravitate towards them and sort of lock onto them. But then from within that, I'm definitely, there's this constant sort of tension in my life where I don't just want to be sort of creating content. Like, I've never been a journalist by personality, even though I've created so much content for, different publications. I've always sort of been in the like, best way to predict the future is to create it sort of camp in terms of where I wanted to spend my time. So yeah, but it's those big patterns that are interesting to me for sure.
So can we talk a little bit about your early days? The question that I have for you is, what do we need to know about your earliest years, the way that you grew up, where you're from, like your early developmental years, to understand the person that you are today?
Yeah, there's so many ways to answer. I had really good parents. That's a big one. No, that's very, very true, but not actually the thing. So maybe something that's actually useful, because this is just cherry picking, pieces that might be valuable. But one of the experiences that I've had constantly throughout my life is a constant redefinition upwards of the capacity of what people can achieve. So one of the things that is sort of my most like strongly, my strongest personality traits, and I mean strong not in terms of good, just in kind of undeniable, is an unwillingness to accept that if there's a thing that I'm interested in, that I shouldn't be able to do it at the highest level that anyone else does, right? And that came out of a particular set of experiences that I've had lots of versions of it, but one of the first ones was I did this thing called academic decathlon in high school. It's an American academic competition, and it's a decathlon. So it's 10 events. It's extremely grueling. Like, I mean, it makes other sort of academic competitions look very simple by comparison. So you have 10 topics across all these different, domains, and you compete at a regional, state, and national level. There's tens of thousands of kids that do it. And it's the type of thing that kids will study for kind of all year. It's an all-encompassing sort of approach. And so when I was a sophomore, I joined my school's team, and my school had, I grew up in Maine, and we had sort of something like, 12 of the 13 years that had been a competition we had won. So we were sort of like the dynasty in our state, but not on a national level. On a national level, it was always Texas, California, who are the big winners. Occasionally a school from Illinois, occasionally a school from Wisconsin, but really it was Texas and California. Those were always the big competitors. And so I had a couple friends who had joined our freshman year, and I was, off, I don't know, being in bands and stuff like that. And then my sophomore year, I joined just like about a month and a half before the state competition. And I got really into it. I was like, well, sort of this thing triggered in me, which is like, I don't like the idea of other people winning things that I'm deciding to compete in. Like if I'm going to do it, I want to do it all the way. And so I kind of went pretty ham, or what I thought was ham, on studying. And I ended up kind of coming out of nowhere to win second in the state. And so, you know, I basically had this feeling. Then I was like, well, if 6 weeks, I was able to get second in the state, I'll go, study my face off for the next month before the national competition, and I'll do really well there. And I got, I think, fifth out of 500 or something at nationals. And when I was at nationals, the most important experience that I had wasn't the scoring or my performance or anything like that. It was seeing the intensity with which these kids from California and Texas were studying. I didn't even realize that there was a mode that you could shift into like that. I mean, these were kids who had started basically studying for this competition the day after the last competition one. They spent all summer doing it. They created their own study materials, not just use the ones that were available. They were just nuts. And it was this instant sort of unlock. It was like, oh, got it. That's what it takes to win this. Okay, if that's what it takes to win this, that's what we'll do. And so I went back and went absolutely crazy, and had basically everyone in my life telling me to like chill out and find balance. But I ended up coming back and getting fourth in the country next year, because I had this unlock of seeing what it took. And it wasn't a question of like some changed capacity to achieve, like I hadn't like done something new from a capacity standpoint. It was just I had the appropriate sense of the work that it was going to take to actually do this.
I hope you're enjoying today's episode. I wanted to take a moment to share something that could potentially make a huge difference for you and your creative business in just 30 minutes. We all need a little therapy sometimes. Brand therapy, that is. If you're a freedom-seeking creative, coach, or online service provider, and you're looking to grow a profitable business without sacrificing your well-being, then I would love to help you. I want to give you a special invite for a free mini brand therapy call. What is brand therapy, you ask? It's like a blend of emotional and physical therapy, but for your business. In this mini session, it's 30 minutes designed to help you gain clarity or cross the finish line with that strategy or task that you've been wrestling with, feeling way too stuck, lost, or overwhelmed to make any significant progress. Some of the things we can discuss in our session include creating or adjusting your website, designing or refining your offerings, creating digital products, tech or system setup, all of those questions and more. If you're ready to get some support in growing your business without sacrificing your well-being, then head over to brookeestin.com/free call. Offer is valid for new clients and only subject to availability. Looking forward to doing some brand therapy together soon. Now, back to the episode.
And so this was sort of the first moment that I had. Like I said, I've had many of them, and we can get into some of the other ones, of a radically sort of leveled up sense of, one, like what you could achieve, and two, what it took to actually do that. And I think that's that's sort of been something that I've just carried with me throughout.
That's so interesting. I see that in you. I can imagine you in those the places that you described, and just the level of like academic athleticism. It sounds like academic Olympics or something.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I loved it. I would figured out how many days of school I could skip and still graduate, and would go to school and just be in a room studying instead of going to my normal classes.
Yeah,
it's very, very intense, but I mean, I loved it.
Yeah. So this naturally sort of leads me into creativity, because that's a very creative approach to designing your high school experience, right? So there's a few questions around that. One, I want to start with, what does creativity mean to you? And then I want to move into the different areas that you apply that in your life.
Sure. I think for me, creativity is about output. It's about, generating things, like creating the world that you want to live in. Like I said, I have my favorite quote. My wife, who you also know, laughs at me all the time because I say this shit so constantly, but It's from a poem by Robert Browning called Andrea del Sarto, which is about an artist. And the quote is, "A man's reach should exceed his grasp, or else what's a heaven for?" And anytime I'm doing some ridiculous thing, or like, I turn around and tell her that I'm going to go, I don't know, start a company and get it funded, like the next week, or some stupid thing that, that I'm trying to do, I drop that quote. It's like it's a meme in our lives now. And so for me, creativity is very much about the process of bringing something into the world, and obviously I think that like the subset of things that people associate with creativity, art and music and all these sort of things, they follow that paradigm, but it's, there's a lot of things that are more subtle. I mean, which is I think the whole subject of the show. So your listeners are probably pretty familiar, but for me that, creativity is the act of generating something and bringing it into the world.
So you identify with being a creative person then, right?
I do, but I tend to be, I don't know. I don't really identify with anything. I just kind of do what I'm doing, and so I don't have a strong. I don't spend much time on self-conception in that way. I spend much more time on sort of, proactive steps. But push to the question, absolutely. I definitely view myself as like creatively minded. Like I'm definitely, if someone was to compare me to, like a STEM personality or something like that, I've always been more associated with sort of the arts and words kids, right? Like pejoratively on the internet, I would be a word cell, versus sort of a math person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you shared a little bit about some of your more intense qualities, that focus, that like I see a goal, anyone else is just in my way. Like I am confident, I am capable. It's just a matter of following the process that's going to actually get me there. So I want to ask you about stress and about doing too much, because it sounds like, I mean, I would have a hard time, I think, finding your off switch. So can you talk a little bit about what stresses you out and how do you work with stress? And where's that line for you between excitement and enthusiasm, and when it bleeds over into stress that can be corrosive?
Sure. A couple things. So I am actually, I am not a workaholic in the sense that I can turn off. And I think it's just because I have really clear other priorities as well, particularly around family.
Yeah.
However, I wouldn't say that my life is sort of like I have a work-life balance. I tend to be in the camp of you have to choose when you want work-life balance, and when there are certain things that you are not allowed to achieve, more or less, if you want work-life balance. An amazing life that's full of success, including commercial success, you can choose. You just have to design it super intentionally if you want to do it with balance. And I think sometimes our conversation, I think we're coming to a reckoning in this conversation where, sort of like work-life balance wasn't even on the agenda. And then there's this sort of huge shift where it's actually become a thing that people talk about. And now we're coming to this sort of middle space, which I think is really healthy, which is like understanding how to, gear in and out of different modes and being okay with different modes for different times in your life, right? And so for me, I have a family now. I have a 3-year-old and a 5-year-old. I was, determined that I wasn't going to miss that, that was not going to be a regret set that I had. And the way that I sort of balance on a meta level is I have the prioritization of that and whatever I'm working on, which means almost no time for anything else. So like, I don't have hobbies. I don't do like, I mean, I like every night after they go to bed, I'm working, right? More or less, aside from sort of, quality time with my wife. And so what I did have to get rid of and lose things, which is sort of, fun in a traditional sense. But, the family is the sort of the counteracting kind of balance for me. I think that when it comes to the stress question, I think I have a very high stress threshold to start, but I don't often, I don't know. I think stress for me emanates from, one, things that are outside my control that have a deterministic impact on my ability to do what it is I'm going to do. So for example, with super intelligent, well, yeah, although that's, I guess for me, the example that I think of is like choosing to do this company as a venture-backed company. And there was never a question that I was going to do that for super intelligent. Now there's a ton of people right now who are building really awesome sort of AI infrastructure support learning type businesses as solopreneurs. I think it's a natural place to apply, because AI has created so many more tools for that type of person, right? It's expanded dramatically the capacity of what an individual can do. But I knew that I thought the scale of opportunity was so big, and the sort of the version of it that I wanted to pursue required going after, I wanted to do it as a sort of a venture-backed company. And one of the relationships that you have to decide that you're going to be okay with is that relationship where investors do hold a lot of the control. Now you can find ways to mitigate it, right? Like Super Intelligent started charging from day one, so it's not sort of like it didn't take the same sort of growth at all costs and no revenue path that other venture-backed companies had in the past. That's obviously a little less popular now, but it's still, there. Anytime you're out fundraising, like you can only control so much. And I think, we can get much deeper into this, but one of the things that is very hard for entrepreneurs is to understand that even if there's nothing wrong with their business, there really is often just it's not you, it's them thing where, investors have a million different options and a million different priorities and a million different things that get them excited. And there might be nothing wrong with your company. It's just that that's not what they're interested in. So that's the type of thing that I think can be fairly stressful. Like there's ways to mitigate it by just controlling all the parts that you can control and basically not making, unforced errors. But, I don't know. I think that maybe more broadly, and zooming out of the specific, the thing that I've always found is that I have never once experienced sort of even a moment of burnout when I'm working on a thing that I'm supposed to be working on and that I'm aligned with. And that is sort of, I understand where it's going and what I'm trying to do with it, even if it's not going well, or perfectly as well as it could be. I think where burnout emanates from, at least for me, and I think this is the experience of a lot of people, is spinning your wheels on something that's not working. And it's an extremely difficult thing. Like one of my most quintessential failures was a company that needed to die for years and years, that I just, basically kept dragging along. And it was this sort of classic version of a company that was like so close to working, but never quite, and it's just sort of the gears kept, not quite catching. But because it was close enough, we could keep sort of like nudging it along, like little investment here, little contract here that kept it going. And it actually, going through that experience pretty fundamentally shifted my sense of how fast and when people should give up on things, which we can get more into if it's interesting. But there was a ton of burnout there because it was the thing that wasn't working. It had its chance to work. It had its chance to be the right thing. And it wasn't any of those. And there were a bunch of reasons that had nothing to do with it that I was clinging on to, which had to do with fear and other things going on in life. So, it sounds silly, but like, I really haven't felt a huge amount of stress since recalibrating after that experience and just sort of, figuring out a different approach to how I was going to drive things. Now, there have been some particular moments of agony and collapse and chaos since then, but in terms of just sort of general day-to-day stress, it's not the same.
Yeah. Do you have any practices that help you calibrate your energy? Like, do you exercise? You do nutrition stuff? You take in supplements? Like, how do you have that level of sustained energy without stress?
So I think probably the most common habit that I have is there's a park around us called Poets Walk Park, where Washington Irving wrote Rumpelstiltskin and came up with the idea for Sleepy Hollow and all these things. And it's right along the Hudson River. And I walk there probably 4 or 5 times a week in the mornings. And I'm basically just chattering to my phone the whole time, taking notes. And so it's very like, it's not salubrious in the sense of like, I'm like decompressing, but I can't be doing anything other than thinking and then outputting the thinking, via voice. And so it's a very sort of like think oriented thing. And I do a lot of the sort of, calibration with myself on those walks. But, beyond that, I think it's more born out of this. I now have an extremely sort of hair trigger set. I'm always looking for that sort of misalignment. I think it's like like a base warning system. It's like white blood cells now, but for, but for sort of misalignment on a career or life perspective.
How do you know when you are misaligned? Like, what are you looking for specifically? And how can you tell a difference between, ooh, this is the thing that this is my intuition, or this is just a bump in the road that is part of doing a startup or growing a business?
I think there's a couple things. I think one, this is not a widely applicable thing necessarily because it manifests so differently for people. But if I ever feel anxiety, versus stress, like that's almost a sure sign that I'm doing something that's misaligned, right? It's a very different sensation. Stress is the body saying, to me at least, whatever, you're doing too much or whatever. Anxiety is like you're doing the wrong thing. And those are very, very different feelings. And like I said, people have such different experiences with anxiety that I wouldn't want to sort of, categorize that as some fundamental rule, but that's one thing for me. I think the other thing is sort of like, I do a lot of zooming out and sort of, asking where it's going. And when the answer starts to be, if a question is like, do I want to be doing this, or where do I want this to be in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it is, when those answers start to look like, and when the answer starts to be done,
Yeah.
that's usually, it's not necessarily a signal that there is immediate term misalignment, but the potential to get into misalignment is higher, right? That it's like there's a time at which that will no longer be serving you, and you have to make a shift. For example of this is, I didn't expect to start to sort of turn away from the crypto space last year, but the AI thing just hit me like a freight train, and for a variety of reasons, it was sort of all consuming. And I had this other crypto podcast, this daily show that, one of the sort of top shows in the space. And I wasn't going to just sort of drop it like a bat. But I knew that if I didn't create some different context for that, it was going to start to drag. And so I ended up selling it to a media company called Blockworks, guys I've known forever in the crypto space, who are, not only incredibly passionate about crypto, who saw all the AI stuff, because I had this conversation with them. And as tons of other outlets were sort of becoming generalist technology or crypto plus AI, they were like, absolutely not. We just want to focus on the thing that we've always been focused on. And so I planted the show with them so that they could bring in new energy to it in terms of like where it wants to grow. So I've started the separation of the breakdown identity from the Nathaniel or NLW identity. I still host it every day, but it's on a path now where it's got sort of different life that I don't have to be responsible for in the same way. So, that's just one example of kind of seeing those early warning signals and trying to sort of, shift things around to get out ahead of them.
Mm-hmm. I know that there's a lot of people that are listening right now who struggle with anxiety, stress, overwhelm, burnout. There's many different ways that people are articulating that experience. And by the time they make it to me, the main problem I'm helping them solve at that point is prioritization. Because you can do it all. You just can't do it all at the same time, because time and energy is finite. And so it is oftentimes difficult in the short run to be able to say, no, I'm going to let that go so that I can have more energy focused on this. But it sounds like that is perhaps something that comes naturally to you, that your priorities are just clear and obvious. Did you have to work through that to get to a place where you had that clarity, or that was always a constant for you?
I think I'm good at anchoring around a big goal. And anchoring around a big goal solves a big part of that. Like you can bumble around and sort of crash into walls a bunch and still be on the same track. It's almost like it's like the bumper rails in a bowling alley. It's like if you're pointed firmly in that direction, even if you're not, swaying wildly, you're going in the direction that you want to go. So, I think that I'm good at that. I think the capacity to sequence things in a very particular order and stay with them the entire time is still a learned skill. That's a practice thing, particularly with discipline. I think it's especially hard with we have a product in this company, super intelligent. It's a platform, And it's different than content. Like if you're doing a podcast and you're trying to sort of make it a business, there's a very specific sequence. And like maybe on the margins, there's some things that are different about your path than other people's paths, but there's a lot that's really similar. You know, there's a lot of collective experience that you can figure out in terms of, you know, how many shows is it going to take to do X or Y? And like, what are the techniques? Where should I put it? There's all this stuff that's sort of known. Whereas when you're building a new product from scratch and hoping that people use it, it's like everything is a guess that you then have to go test. And almost no matter how well funded you are, there's the ability to your ability to think up ideas and things that would be cool to build and could be useful is going to radically outstrip the capacity to do so.
Yes.
And so, you know, even for, you know, someone who I think has like I said, a pretty high sort of grounding and, you know, and a good ability to constantly be recalibrating what true north is, it's still a difficult challenge to figure out how to sequence things correctly. I think though, maybe to bring it to a sphere that's sort of less startup-y and more personal level, because, you know, I actually didn't think when I left San Francisco in 2017, basically the commitment that I had made to myself was that I wasn't going to that I didn't. But part of why I was leaving is that I didn't really care ultimately about San Francisco or you know, technology's story of success. I think when you're in an environment, you get very wrapped up in whatever the sort of dominant you know, story of success is. And in San Francisco, it's about you build a company, you sell it, and then you do some other stuff. And you know, this is constant competition. And I knew so many people, I'm sure you knew them too, who had, you know, sold their company for $50 million and still felt behind because all of their friends had sold their companies for $100 million.
Yeah.
And these were not people, like, they were self-aware of that being a crazy feeling, but it didn't matter. You know, it didn't matter that they were self-aware. It was still a thing. And I found, you know, I was looking around in 2016, 2017 when I was still there, and just, you know, not seeing almost anyone whose life I wanted to have. And when there was like no one who's, you know, sort of in that monoculture whose life I wanted to have, I was like, I need to get out a little bit. And so I kind of broke away for a little while. And you know, effectively what I said to myself is like, you know, I don't need to be the CEO. I don't need to be the founder of things. That's not a priority for me. And so for the next set of years, you know, I spent it consulting, doing content. Like, I assumed that I would never kind of work for a single company again. And that got changed and stuff too. But one of the things that I did say though, is that, you know, I would listen if there was a company that I felt like it was specifically I was supposed to build. You know, I would listen to that. And that's sort of where super intelligent came from. But anyways, the point of this is that for the previous sort of 5.5, 6 years before starting Super Intelligent late last year, I was on a very independent sort of, you know, consulting plus content creator plus solopreneur type track. And within that, I think that still under discussed, even though it's so obvious, is like, it's very hard. It is very easy to get anxious and discombobulated when you haven't solved core financial mobility. Like, there are very few people who can compartmentalize the stress of where certain bills are going to come from, or, you know, how they're going to solve debt issues, while and also sort of, you know, plow forward with their big plans. One of the things that I wish that we talked more about, and because I was so never this person, is the value of starting things on the side, you know, and just appreciating that. I was always such a like, no, screw this, I'm going to do exactly what I want all the time, that I never even considered that. And I actually think it was to my serious detriment in technology. Like, when I give people advice, they're like 21, 22 and coming to San Francisco for the first time, my general kind of base level advice, knowing nothing about them, is basically find the fastest sort of, you know, Series A, Series B type startup that you can, and go in that and learn from it. And then sort of like work your way down lower, you know, earlier and earlier, closer and closer to the founding, if that's sort of a thing that you want. And, you know, versus what I did, which was like, oh, I'm just going to go out and start things. You know, it's like, it's much harder to learn from, you know, just your own kind of discombobulated experience in that setting than it is from being close to other people who are going through it. And I think there's sort of it's very different, but a proxy for, you know, the solopreneurs or content creators or these things like that is, you know, there's so much space to do those things outside and around, you know, wherever else you're making money and solving those sort of base level, like Maslow's hierarchy type issues. And And it sucks because it's very hard to split focus between things and have a huge amount of your energy consumed by, the thing that's just paying the bills. And knowing where to actually draw the line to make the leap is, it's a discipline that's, entire podcasts, entire books are just focused on knowing that. But I do think that, maybe we should value that experience a little bit more, just because, like I said, it's like weighing the stress of having this other time suck versus weighing the anxiety of money. It's very hard. And a pretty high percentage of the people who I know who have given up on whatever their dream was, it was because it was a financial thing, because they weren't in a position to just actually cover life.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a topic I explore a lot with people. And this is also part of where life design can be a really helpful tool, right? Because the people listening to this podcast are people who live in a capitalistic society. And when you're in a capitalist society, you pay for things with money. If you don't have money, you don't have your things, like a roof over your head. So it's a very clear setup that exists in the, Western capitalist kind of world that's difficult to escape. But you can get really creative about how you do that. And I did. Like I was making plenty of money in Silicon Valley. I was, at the 10K a month or whatever, and it was coming every month for years. Like I was doing good, but I was spending almost all of my money just on my lifestyle. I chose to live alone. That was really important for me in that life. I wanted spaciousness. I wanted privacy. I wanted that independence. So I chose to pay for my own apartment. I chose to travel. I chose to go out and play and like live a really vibrant life. And there was so little left. When I made the decision to leave the United States and to come to Europe, I intentionally chose a place where it was significantly less expensive. I moved to Spain. I didn't go to Barcelona, which is comparable to Silicon Valley. I went to a small town where my 3-bedroom, beautiful penthouse apartment costs 650 euros a month, right? There are ways around this financial block as long as you're able to be creative about it. And I imagine this is probably something we can talk a lot about because this involves technology. I live in a place where my expenses are significantly lower, so my burden to earn is much lower than it was, but my profit margins are higher, even on a smaller amount of money than anything I did when I was living in the States. But I've been able to set my business up so that I'm working with clients that are in the United States and used to paying those prices, right? A lot of it gets eaten up by the Spanish government because of all the taxes they have to pay living here. But still, there are ways to dramatically improve your quality of life and give yourself the freedom and the runway that oftentimes the financial piece just blocks people from being able to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's sort of one of the core tenets that you deal with on this podcast, but it's very hard to not have that foundation solved in some way and to go off and try to build things.
Yeah, anywhere. And I'm also very aware and conscious of the privilege that I have to be able to do that. Because if you're already in a really tough economic situation, it's, once you fall off that bottom rung of the ladder, especially in the United States, there's not a lot of support to get you climbing back up. And so I just want to speak to that and acknowledge that. But I'd love to move into a little bit about your lifestyle design, because you have you've set yourself up in a way that seems very intentional. You're clear on your focus, on your priorities, what you need in order to execute on your goals. And you removed yourself from the environment that we were just speaking about, and you went to a completely different part of the world, perhaps as different from Silicon Valley as Spain. I'm not sure, but I'd love to invite you to share a little bit about how you designed your life and whether or not you had a conscious awareness of that's what you were doing, or you were just making a series of choices that created the lifestyle that you have now.
I think it's a combination. There are a couple things that I knew I knew that, by the time I left, I didn't want to be in cities anymore. I wanted to be outside the city. And this was 2017, so we kind of did the COVID push before COVID happened.
You're so
And I think
leading edge. You didn't even
yeah,
know that one.
yeah. And I think the interesting thing about COVID was that it pushed a bunch of people into that maybe would have hung on to sort of city living for a little while longer. And it pushed a bunch of people who were sort of on the fence to do it, who then boomeranged back and were like, no, screw it, I actually want to be in the city. And they came back to cities with renewed excitement and energy again, and a different sense of how much time they needed to spend outside the city to get sort of the balance they wanted. So I actually think when it comes to aligning people with just from the core decision of where physically they want to be, then I actually think COVID will be a net benefit to society and having sort of like nudged people into that. I think that we were always on this path where I don't think that you're going to get away from, you know, I think that cities are going to be the new college choice that people make, right? They're going to pick like which cities or which city or combination of cities they want to spend their 20s in, just because the density of people, especially when you're trying to meet partners, when you're trying to build networks, when you're trying to find romantic partners, like all of those things, like densities of cities are totally differentiated for that. It's very hard. Like I can't imagine, even though I'm such a not sort of like core city person, having done this type of move, living sort of up in the Hudson Valley in my 20s, just it wouldn't have made that much sense. So, but by the time we left, I knew I was ready to leave, and it was preemptive to like having kids, but it was with that sort of thing in mind. So I think that is a very anchor decision for people, is sort of where they want to live, and I do think that I am a huge I'm hugely glad that remote is now sort of firmly in the mainstream of normalized. I am not one of these zealots who says that everything has to be remote all the time. And I think there's going to be tons of people who get their energy from being in person. And I think companies are going to leverage the power they have to sort of force decisions on people that sometimes, be in offices when they don't want to be. But it's, let's put it this way. It has never been a question from any investor that I've talked to, like if I needed to sort of form an office or just start things remote. Like I was always going to build this company remotely, but it's never even come up as a consideration, because it's just, at this point, it's entrepreneurs are going to make whatever decision they're going to make on that. And it just doesn't really factor that much, I don't think, into funding decisions anymore, as long as they're demonstrated able to do it. So that was one really sort of big sort of intentional thing. I think that for me, sort of winning back power in the form of like economic power and bargaining power in the form of having my own sort of work or professional assets was a really big shift after I left San Francisco. So another sort of moment of unlock was realizing that I could just sell my time, basically like I've always done things a lot faster than average. And so, after I finally sort of ditched the startup that had needed to die for like 5 years before I ditched it, I then started just basically selling myself like 6 times over, And so when I sort of shifted to a consulting model, I was working all the time, but it's like, but making remarkable amount more cash than I could have with clients, because, that was just sort of where my priorities were. And the interesting thing about that was that, so when COVID hit, I like raced to book more clients. I went out and got like 3 or 4 more, because I figured that there was going to be some sort of, fall off over time, and diversification was a form of sort of, basically, hedging for me. Right. And so, starting podcasts and having advertising revenue from that is another sort of thing. So, I don't know, for me, like one big part of the intentional life design, like I said, is where to be. Another part was certainly subject to the whims of a single company, in quite the same way that I had been in the past.
So how did you think about positioning yourself? Because this is one of the problems that a lot of people that I work with come across. They're doing a lot of different diverse things, and they really struggle with how to define their own brand. Do you feel like you have a personal brand, or are you really just building these company brands? And if you do identify with having a personal brand, how do you think about your brand when you have so much diversity?
Yeah, I'm less intentional about personal brand building than a lot of similar people, but I think it's because there's been sort of a default brand that arose out of, well, so there's kind of separate answers for separate disciplines, right? So in the context of like podcasting and content creation, I knew that I was trying to create a different format with the podcast, which was not particularly novel. But basically, when I started the crypto show in 2019, the observation that I made was that if you look at cable news and basically just sort of, pretty much all TV media, like 90% of content is people sitting around talking about the news. That's true for politics. That's true for sports. It's not like the news, like delivering the news, it's news analysis, right? And at the time in crypto, there was no podcasts that were doing that. That was just sort of talking about what people were talking about. Tons of sort of one-off interview shows, because that's like, that's what people think of when they think of podcasts. And so I basically copied cable news instead of copying, instead of copying sort of other podcasts. And it worked. It was very sort of successful because it was offering something different. But I think it was also well suited to me because I like sort of big diverse opinions and arguments and stuff. I'm very out of sync with the contemporary climate of stake out a position that's as extreme as possible and be as loud about it as possible. I think I have very strong opinions, but I mean, almost so comfortable with them that I don't know, not scared to sort of engage with sort of the opposite opinions, I guess. And in the context of the podcast that I've done, that has that space and sort of engagement with lots and lots of different ways of looking at topics has become the brand in some ways. It's sort of like, old school newscaster, kind of brand. And it's not something, like I said, that I've actively tried to cultivate for myself. It's just naturally arisen from the approach to content that I was taking. I think that there probably are ways that I could be more intentional about that. But again, like the sort of podcasting and media was always just one side of things. And so, like I haven't been as intentional as if I was making that sort of the whole thing. I don't have good advice, I don't think, when it comes to how to select a place to be. I do think in general it's valuable. I think it's very hard. It's very hard to not have defined something really crisply, and it's hard to define. It's hard to be in a place where you haven't sort of defined it in the context of, things that people understand. To try to kind of create and craft something new. But I do think that the sort of, to the extent that there's a takeaway, I think it's likely that finding the intersection of the Venn diagram of like crisp, clear articulation in the context of things that people already know and experience and authentic to self is like where the sweet spot is. Like you can't choose something that's not you. People are very attuned to inauthenticity and they'll root it out pretty quickly. But I also think that you have to engage with people where they are too, and sort of speak to things that they understand.
So when you were talking before about when COVID hit and you just rushed to get clients, how are you getting work? How are you getting clients? Or I imagine it's different at that time, but without the brand behind you or that intentionality, Nathaniel.com or wherever you would send people to, how were you continuing to have all of these rich professional experiences? Yeah, what was your process?
So networks and content are the two most valuable things that people can build, right? So don't know what the equivalent now is, but in the late 2000s, early 2010s, there were a lot of these sort of network alternatives to almost like alternatives to college that were forming, right? There was like the TED People Network, and there was, the Summit Series was the one that I was sort of most strongly connected with. And, there were others sort of, the social entrepreneurship like really kind of was a little bit of a network around that. And those are sources of strength that, that carry for a long time, like each of those networks, I still, the Summit Series is a remarkable thing. So its strongest period, I think, in terms of when it was sort of like, I mean, it's still around. They've done a bunch of things since then, but I think that the sort of the heyday of it was this period 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, right? When it was sort of like really, really started before they bought a mountain in Utah. And the group of people who went to these events back then, still to this day, a decade later, all pretend to have met and know each other, even if they haven't. Right? It's like you can go and see if you ever look on Facebook, because Facebook was still sort of big in use. Any person that I have like 300 people in common with, it's almost guaranteed to be Summit Series. And I look through half of them, and I don't actually remember anything about that person. But I guarantee if I reached out in sort of some professional capacity, they'd pretend, because it was sort of a qualifying experience. And I think it's less it was part of that for that particular community was that the experience that we all had with peers was so good in most cases, like not just on a professional level, but just it was a very enjoyable thing, that there was sort of that additional context. But whatever the networks are, I think networks are extremely valuable. And, I think this is part of why I don't anticipate even people who know that they want to live rurally or whatever in their 30s, 40s, 50s, I think they're still going to go to cities in their 20s to sort of find whatever version of those networks they are. Or maybe they'll all be internet based in the future. I don't know. It's, everything changes. Networks are one piece. The other piece, though, is content. Content has sort of always been a thing. Like you said, you found me through blogging. When I was doing the social entrepreneurship blog with change.org, and I've always used content as sort of a part of whatever it was that I was doing, as sort of part of a way to build a brand in a space. And so when I came out here and I started sort of shifting a lot of my attention to Bitcoin and crypto, I had a sort of the sequence of things that led up to doing the podcast. The first was I started doing this thing called Long Read Sunday. So in 2018 on Twitter, Threads had just started, and people had just started using the form of Threads, as sort of proxy blog posts. And it was a very vibrant time for this medium. Like people were posting really, really interesting things. And, 2018, 2019 were an interesting time for crypto because it was sort of deep bear market, post ICO boom. But that meant that the people who were around were really interesting and thinking on a deep level. They weren't just talking about the sort of prices of things. They were having these sort of interesting philosophical conversations around, decentralized networks as an alternative to sort of big tech and all this sort of shit. And a huge amount of it was getting expressed in Threads because people were discovering that they, a thing that they felt uncomfortable translating all the way up into a blog post, that would take them hours and hours and hours, they could rattle off in a thread, in 30 minutes in a way that was very satisfying and, direct to an audience. And so this was all happening, but these threads, by the nature of Twitter, they're extraordinarily ephemeral. They're gone, in a moment. And so I started doing this thread of threads, which I called Long Read Sunday, where basically I would sort of like weave the narrative of the previous week, intersecting news and the threads that people were talking about. And so it was both sort of an encapsulation of the top threads of the previous week, but I did it at this sort of narrative arc. And that built me like, my first 50,000 followers on Twitter or something like that. And, that I, turned into a newsletter and I became known for that. And so that was sort of like content, point one. That then turned into this sort of thing that became the podcast, although I spent like 6 months experimenting with format before it was sort of fully the breakdown that it became. And so, I've definitely always used content as a way to get known in a space in advance of, having legitimacy in it.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit, not in a ton of detail, but we talked a little bit about some of the failures that you had with like the startup that you've referred to several times, of the one that needed to die for years before it actually died. And, I've seen you cycle through other experiences as well. So can you talk a little bit about some of your best successes, like your creative ideas that just materialized and happened and like fed you, nourished you?
Sure. I think, so I think that they often have started with these sort of, content approaches and creating mobility for myself to sort of do things. I don't know. I kind of have like I don't even know. so not focused on sort of the past that it's hard to look at things. I mean, so there have been a couple chapters that felt complete, like I did the thing that I was trying to do, and then I moved on. So when I went to school at Northwestern, and when I was in college, it was right after September 11th, and there was this huge uptick in people both studying abroad and volunteering abroad. And a lot of people were having this experience of basically being shocked that the rest of the world was so big and violent and chaotic when, we grew up in the 90s with this idea that, post-Cold War, everything was great and hunky-dory. And actually, in point of fact, the 90s were the most violent decade since the 40s. And September 11th obviously brought that recognition home. And that was a catalyst for a lot of people to want to go out and explore the world. And tons and tons of people were having this experience of basically going out and saying, I want to make a difference. I want to make a change. I want to be engaged with the world. And just all of the things that were available to them, all the structures that were available to them, all the, sort of like volunteer opportunities were just terrible, useless at best, actively harming at worst. And despite the sort of perception at the time of millennials or whatever, it wasn't like they wanted a gold star for going out and doing this. People came back very frustrated, and they wanted to do something more. And the average answer that they were getting from professors was an academic answer. It's like, well, go study development studies. And I remember being very frustrated. Like, you can't tell a whole generation that's raising their hand and saying they want to do something to like sit down and do more school. And so I started a thing at the time called the Center for Global Engagement at Northwestern. And it was basically a program design center to create a different type of learning approach to teach people how to make an impact in the world. And that was sort of, there was a sequence of steps, but basically I got Northwestern to fund the thing, and I stuck around for a few years after school doing it. And ultimately it led to what was at the time Northwestern's biggest donation ever. Warren Buffett's sister, Bertie Buffett, donated $100 million to the center that the Center for Global Engagement was a part of to endow that and create it. And so, I left after 3 years, and I was hyper aware even at the time that I wasn't going to stick around Northwestern and build it. And so I kind of designed it to have no founders syndrome right from the get-go. And so I left after 3 years, but it's been literally 20 years now almost. And all of those programs are still running. They've expanded, they've grown. The student organization that we started before it became a program design center is the second biggest on Northwestern's campus, I think. The study abroad program send like 200-300 kids every year abroad. So, that was one that was like a very distinct, there was a beginning, a middle, and an end. It had a goal, it achieved it, and it was sort of off to the next thing. I think my time in Silicon Valley was a little bit more variable. It was a little all over the place. It was a lot of sort of like personal learning versus personal success for a lot of that. I will say that, the context that we came into contact through is when I was helping change.org build out. And the interesting thing about that was I was not sort of formative in change.org ultimately figuring out what it became into. It turned into this very powerful petition site that, again, it's been 16 years, 17 years now since it started, and it's, continued to grow. But at the time, this is funny to talk about now, but it was still at the time when people thought there was going to be a social network for everything, right? There was going to be a Facebook for X and a Facebook for Y. And when I moved to San Francisco in 2008, 2009, there were so many social networks for social change that there was actually an aggregator that allowed you to like post your actions to all of them at once, because there was, it's so many people competing for that slot. And with change, it was this sort of, just this bucket of features. There was, fundraising, there was communication, there was all these things. It was a kitchen sink type of approach. And we didn't know it was going to work. But what we did know is that, there had to be an audience, a critical mass to figure it out. And that's where the media strategy came from. That's where the content strategy came from. And so we created this network of blogs, the goal of which was basically to be the top ranked publication in each of these cause areas. There were 10 at the time. Human rights, gay rights, climate change, or I think it was called global warming at the time, social entrepreneurship, and a set of others. And that got us our first couple million users on change.org. It was that content before the site even really knew what it was going to be when it grew up. Yeah. So that was sort of, again, I was a very small part of that success, but it was a success. And, there's a whole podcast to be done about the resilience of change.org and how that company has sort of encountered sort of waves and after waves of different challenges and is still stuck around. But then there's a long period of mostly learning and stuff coming up into into this sort of crypto period where I had probably the most dramatic, like come up, come down of, so
To hear all about
the TLDR is that I was the head of marketing for FTX,
yeah.
and the Tom Brady ads, the Larry David Super Bowl ad, all of that was me. And I perceived to be a full-on rebrand of this entire industry. If you looked at those ads, they don't talk about FTX. They don't talk about features of FTX. It was about a very different vision for crypto that didn't have this prerequisite of being any one type of person. That was predicated on the idea that in a world where most people are born into financial instability and unstable monetary regimes, having monetary systems that exist and operate outside of that as well was a valuable thing. And there were big invitations to more people to come in and sort of be a part of this and bring whatever they were bringing to it. Like the first ad that we released, the first major, national campaign was Tom Brady and Giselle, calling everyone they knew of all different walks of life, inviting them to come participate. And that was very much sort of like the tone that we were trying to set. Now, of course, a couple of years later, it turns out that, the sort of the foundations of the company were sort of, well, the foundations of the company were fraudulent. The very specific behaviors of the CEO were fraudulent in a way that's, now led to him being, in jail for the next 25 years. I went from literally making our follow-up Super Bowl ad one weekend to, having to resign very, very publicly, and losing tens of millions of dollars worth of sort of, equity that just exploded into nothing. So that was a pretty wild experience. But I got to say, the interesting thing, and maybe we can get into this, is like the pain of that was much less severe than finally giving up this stupid startup before that needed to die for so long.
Tell me about that, because I don't even know the end or how that story went. You were working on it and then it worked.
It was very simple. Like I said, it was a company that always should have been a consulting firm, not a venture-backed company. We helped big brands figure out how to work with startups. And it would have been an amazing consultancy. It would have been $25,000-$50,000.
Jesse was a face of it as well. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so, it would have been great as, doing $25,000 project here, $50,000 project here, but because it was venture backed, every time we got one of those deals, it was immediately spun back into sort of building out this platform side of it. And again, it just, there was nothing wrong with it. It wasn't the sort of right format for the company. And it had a very long time of trying and pivoting and, figuring itself out, and it hadn't. And basically the way that the story ended was the original CEO and founder, actually he was the second CEO, one of the original co-founders. He was the first CMO. Then he became the CEO. He was leaving. He was basically being acquired away to another firm that had looked at acquiring the company, but then decided not to. And he asked if I wanted to take it over. And I basically called up our lead investor. I thought I sort of soft negotiated a deal for them to acquire us, to sort of build it as a consulting firm inside their house. And I said yes to taking over as CEO. And, 7 months later, after sort of endless dragging their feet, they pulled the plug on that acquisition at the like, not even the 11th hour, like the 11th hour and the 59th minute. And it felt at the time like the whole world was imploding. Like we had to get out of the office where a couple people were living inside of a few weeks. And the funny thing is, in retrospect, literally, other than like, I don't know, 6 people who were working on it at that time, no one cared. The investors had written down this investment years ago. The amounts that they had invested were so small that like they had forgotten about them. Like it was an unbelievably small thing in the actual like size of the universe. But for the people who were going through it, who had sort of poured so much into it, it felt huge. And so that was sort of this big, huge learning experience. It was, its failures were based in large parts on decisions that I had actually made, not things that were outside my control. There was some outside my control. Whereas the FTX implosion was, it was a blind side, but it wasn't, FTX was never my thing. I found myself in this unique position. I'm the single greatest marketing position that anyone will ever hold. I firmly believe that no one will ever have a better marketing job than I had for 2 of effectively unlimited budget and the ability to sort of do all these things. But it was painful in a lot of ways. It was painful in terms of the betrayal. It was painful in terms of like the actual facts of the fraud and the damage that was caused. it was painful and sort of, possibilities lost, but it was also ultimately, it wasn't mine. And it was just a thing that happened. And anyway, so it was a pretty fascinating experience to have these things which are so different in scale, like one of the really the biggest, frauds in American history feel small compared to this, this very tiny nothing startup that no one will ever remember the name of, failing.
I remember it. Wow. So, with all of those kind of epic experiences, can you think of a thorough line of learnings? Like, is there a theme? Do you keep returning back to something, or are they each offering you completely different lessons?
I think that they're all different lessons. Like ultimately, any person is their own through line, right? How they make sense and meaning out of experiences. So when we talk about resilience, what's the difference between a person who's resilient and not? It has almost nothing to do with what happens to them. It has to do with how they interpret what happens, how they make
Trauma
sense of
too.
what happens.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think the one common thread is that I just, bound forward no matter what. I think it's the only thing that I know how to do is to just keep going. Like if super intelligent died tomorrow, I'd just pick up the next day and start something else, or do something else. Like it's just sort of, the constant forward momentum. But I think each of the things that they had totally different lessons in different ways, and both positive and negative. There was a lot of things, a ton of, very bad lessons from FTX, but there were also part of what made that so frustrating is that Sam didn't have to be just shipping off everyone's money when they came into his hedge fund. The company was legitimately making $1 billion a year, $3 to $10 million a day from trading fees. We literally had the ability to do anything that we wanted. And the company itself, in terms of the people who were there, it was so stacked with talent. I mean, like Sam almost had a fetish around how much he believed each person could do more than what we normally think. And so every person on that team did the work of like 5, 6, 7, 10 people. And I do think that being in that environment for a couple of years, hold aside the way that it ended, totally transformed my expectations of how fast the thing could be built and how fast things can move in ways that are positive. I mean, maybe difficult for my team now in terms of what the expectations they have to deal with on my part. But, so I think everything is a combination of good lessons and bad lessons, and you have to make sense of it all.
So how do you see the future? You're working with a topic that literally everybody's talking about. And I think the most present feeling that at least I'm privy to is a feeling of fear. It's like causing an existential crisis of if AI can do all of this, then what will we do? So how do you see the future in general, but particularly the role that AI is going to play our professional lives?
It is completely understandable why people are scared, and it's going to be unfathomably awesome. It is going to be so unlocking. So here's my base case of why, we can get into all the details, but I have a very core belief on why it will be better than people think. The question is, if it takes 1/10 of the time and effort and money to create all the code we have now and all the images we have now and all the things, does that mean that we're going to create exactly the same amount of stuff, but just at 1/10 of the time or 1/10 of the cost and go use all that extra time for whatever? Or does it mean we're going to create 10 times as much stuff? I'm 100% convinced that it's the second, that if you look at the human capacity for creation and consumption, it is absolutely voracious. It is never ending, right? I mean, to our detriment sometime, how voracious we are. And I think that the reality is that the world is just going to create so unfathomably more stuff than it does right now that it's going to be very hard to imagine. And I think that there's precedent for this, right? If you look at just look at entertainment right now compared to the 90s. In the 90s, everyone, they would come to work and they would talk about the episode of Friends or Seinfeld or Home Improvement that happened the night before. Now there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different shows fragmenting people's attention, right? We've already seen this mass fragmentation. That pattern is going to play out in the future where, it wouldn't surprise me if in 15 years, none of us watch the same things because it's all just sort of, I'm living in the IP of like, I'm watching season 28 of West Wing because that's all I want to watch. And I can sort of create, these versions of it. And it's not to say that that's better or worse or anything. It's just different. But I think that we're just going to make more stuff. We're going to create more stuff. And I think that there will be really difficult transformations, right? Because the ways that people have built their lives and expected work is going to change faster probably than our capacity to actually make sense of it in many cases. And I think that there will be like a real transitional challenge. However, I think that the capability that people have to output more, to create more, especially for a lot of the folks who are, probably listening to this podcast, who are thinking about designing intentional careers and being solopreneurs and stuff, like this set of tools is 100x what you can do as an individual. Sam Altman from OpenAI said, he made an argument that they were going to see the first, billion-dollar company from a solopreneur. And it was a little bit of a sort of, a tongue-in-cheek, get people talking kind of quote. But I think that that what's behind it is true, like in the sense of just the expanded capacity. Now, different people are going to take advantage of that expanded capacity in different ways, right? I remember right around that time that I was sort of going and recruiting all these clients around the beginning of COVID. I was talking to my brother, who's a very different type of a person. He's a very much a sort of a work to live person instead of a live to work person. And when I was explaining to him how I sort of like arbitraged this, he was like, man, that means you could like just pick 3 of these clients and then have 50% of your time to just like go skiing or whatever, which is what he was sort of fantasizing about. Yeah. It was like, or I could recruit 7 clients, and instead of 3. And so the point being that like, there's going to be a lot of people who figure out, the promise of the 4-hour work week, from Tim Ferriss forever ago, who just design systems where they have way more space. There's going to be other people who, use every amount of time that they have, but can create, entire worlds that are totally different. I don't know. I think that we can get into maybe some of the specific things that people are scared or nervous about, but net, I think that where this all lands is the history of humanity suggests to me that when we have a level up moment in our capacity to create more stuff, we just create more stuff and we commercialize it and we sell it and we create economies around it. And things change and they can change radically and not always for the better, but I just don't see us sitting still. And I think that this will create sort of way more opportunity.
Considering that one of the main problems that my audience and the listeners of this podcast are struggling with is that feeling of time scarcity, how do you see in particular helping creatives to basically overcome this burnout of constantly doing everything because they can essentially use tools to help maximize what they're able to do in less time?
Sure. So I think actually, again, this audience has more to benefit from than almost any other, right? So if you are a solopreneur who's doing anything, like whether you're selling consulting services or selling, handmade ceramic ghosts for Halloween decorations on Etsy or something, the reality at this point is that means that you are also a social media marketer. That means that you are an email marketer. That means you're a web designer. That means you're a PR firm. That means you are a sales and audience, targeting and outreach person. That means you're a customer service person. That means you're, you are all of those things. And every single one of those things I just mentioned has new tools and new systems coming online to make them work better, faster, or cheaper, right? And that doesn't mean that you can just it's not going to be as simple as flipping a switch, right? It's going to take a lot of really intentional workflow design. People are going to have to sort of figure out which compromises they're willing to make and not when it comes to sort of, the quality of AI. Something that we've experienced with Super Intelligent is, so we have all of this great, really strong video content that really should be being chopped up and turned into hundreds of pieces of content for all over the internet, all these different social media channels every day. And we were sort of like spinning our wheels a little bit on this. And it was because like we hadn't accepted the 30% decrease in quality of just letting AI write the stupid copy was worth the fact that it could create, 200% more stuff and actually get it there if we just let it do it. And we made the decision at some point that like, look, we're spending our effort on creating the great starting content of this video collateral. We're not outsourcing that piece. the like turning, reading the transcript and turning it into a fire tweet, like screw it. Let AI do that. And, it's like that's a compromise that we're willing to make. I think individuals are going to have to figure out those sort of things, like it may be that there's a primary channel that they just want to own because it's like they're tastemakers. For example, I think that Instagram will be a really hard channel to fully automate with AI because Instagram is so much about aesthetic and taste, and like when you look at someone's grid, you can instantly like feel if that like resonates with you. And it's just like this, like you could blur your eyes and still have that, sort of impressionistic thing. I think that's going to be really hard to just sort of outsource and automate. Whereas just the grind of Facebook ads or, or Twitter posts or LinkedIn posts, like, again, huge difference between a great one of those things and an okay version of those things. But they, those are channels that might reward more volume versus curation. And it's going to be the same with customer service, figuring out where to draw the lines on what type of interactions are fine for AI to have and which, when you need to be called in. But like I said, each of these things has a set of tools that are being developed and a new set of systems that are being developed around those tools that are going to allow people to sort of do a lot more, and I think it's, we kind of like simplistically like to say it frees up humans to do more of the thing that they want to do. And maybe that's true. I think that that's partially true. I think it's more just like to earn the right to do the thing that you want to do on a core level, you kind of have to own doing all the other things. That's just the nature of it, right? Like authors lament now that they have to be social media personalities as well. I hear this complaint all the time from people who, they used to just want to write books, but that's the reality of the world now. And there's no getting around it. It just is the nature of things. This potentially, recalibrates a bunch of that, in ways that were sort of unfulfilling, but you still had to do them before, So I don't know that I think it'll necessarily be like the time balance that people spend on each of these things might still be the same. But when the time is still the same, but you're reaching 10 times the number of people, that probably is going to mean that your business is going better, right? That you're getting more of the clients that you want, you're getting more of the buyers that you want. So I don't know. I think that and it won't last forever, but there is still an early mover advantage right now where people who kind of figure out these systems and get out ahead, well, one, they're likely to see benefits in whatever it is that they're doing, but they're also building an unbelievably amazing skill set that they're going to be able to reapply if they want, right? Like going back to the conversation that we were having at the beginning around, how do you pay the piper to be able to do the things that you want? If a person spent the next 6 to 12 months trying to start an online store or a consultancy or something using all of these AI tools and it just didn't work, well, then they've spent 12 months building AI skills that they can go sell to someone who needs those skills, in this transitional period. It's valuable even in that sense, just because it's this sort of new frontier of working where, there's not much substitute for just actually trying it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's important also, and framing it that way as, not that AI is coming for your job, but instead there's a new tool to help you do your work in the way that is most aligned with where you're at. Do you want more? Do you want to do your work on a bigger scale, or do you want more time so that you can go skiing in the mountains or, see a flamenco show midday? Yeah. So I love that because I think with creatives and particularly creatives who are also in the spiritual space, right? They look at AI and there is this rejection, this fear, this lack of understanding, but also this intimidation of, maybe not intimidation, but maybe being intimidated at the dramatic difference that we can all perceive is coming. And change is uncomfortable. And a lot of people just by default reject it first until they're able to, hear it or understand it or experience it in a way that shifts their perspective. So I like that you're framing it as something that is expansive and can increase the creative potential that somebody has instead of something that's going to replace them or take them out of it. I also think it's really important when I talk about this with my clients also, of doing the work, but doing the right work, not just like spinning your wheels work. You want to schedule a meeting? Yeah, sure. You can schedule a meeting. Should you be doing that back and forth in email or text message? Absolutely not. Like just send them a damn link. So there's these things of, okay, what problem are you trying to solve? How are you going about doing that? And is that the best use of your time and energy? Does that create the best experience for you and other people? Or is there a tool that you can rely on, that you can integrate, that you can learn? And it's almost always worth putting in that initial time and energy to learn it so that you can use it in the context you wanted to, or like you suggested, you have that knowledge in your back pocket. It might not have worked for that thing, but it does allow you to bring more tools to the next problem that you're facing.
I think one of the things that I've found with people who have a positive sense of AI is a lot of them have had some introductory experience or stumbled into some introductory experience where it wasn't about work, it was just about sort of fun or joy. And this is the thing that people forget. Like, it is really cool to be able to create stuff. It is really, really fun. It's part of it. So for me, my sort of introductory experience was so I mean, it will forever be, I think, one of the great demonstrations of technology's upswings and downswings. That the month that FTX collapsed was the same month that ChatGPT launched, right? It was like, one tens of billions of dollars company, gone overnight, and this new phenomenon started. Obviously, ChatGPT will be a much bigger thing in the annals of history. But so in the wake of that, I was sort of just, it's a little shell shocked for a few minutes. But my brother-in-law, he had been working on this fantasy novel forever. That was sort of his thing that he was focused on. And one day he showed up we were playing Magic the Gathering or something some night. And he took out his phone and he started showing me all these illustrations for his book. And it was unbelievably cool stuff, right? He had been like messing around on Discord with this instance of Stable Diffusion called Unstable Diffusion, which is basically a not safe for work version. So like, it could have weird fantasy art, with crazy women and like half naked dudes, Conan the Barbarian style. And it was so cool that he had created all this stuff. And so I started messing around with Midjourney, and I would find myself, like not paying attention to whatever I was watching on TV, because I was like, what would Ernest Hemingway sitting at Le Dumago in the 1920s in Paris look like? I'd punch it in, and it's like these things that sort of like were the unbelievable creations. And that is a like kind of a capital F fun experience. One of the things we see on Super, tons and tons of parents have had an experience of using ChatGPT with their kids to create stories, or using Midjourney or DALL-E with their kids to illustrate the things coming out of people's minds. And I think that this is that one of the contentious issues around this is sort of, artists and what the space for artists will be in the future. I think they're really meaningful and important discussions to have, particularly in terms of sort of rights and ethics of training. And, that's a whole conversation that society has to have at speed now. But let's assume that these things continue to exist, because they're just going to, the genie's out of the bottle. My belief is that it seems very unlikely to me that the net impact is less work for, visual creatives. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is there's going to be a ton of stuff that never would have made it to an actual project that would being paid for that now does, that people like. When you start to create this stuff, it starts to generate new ideas for how you might want to do that in the future. Like I've used these things to create entire sort of custom Magic the Gathering sets as sort of this fun, like, stress releasing activity. And that was something that I never would have done in the past. And I never would have hired anyone for it. But it created sort of this pathway where I ended up hiring someone on Upwork to actually sort of like finalize it, package it, put it into cards that could be sent off for printing, like actually do the thing. Like it turned into from this like random idle thing to a real thing. And so actually someone that got hired that wouldn't have before, and I think that we're going to see, again, I don't at all want to underestimate the pain of the transition, because there will be categories of tasks and activities that are totally changed and transformed. And there's going to be a lot of ways of working that get upended overnight. And the speed with which these things will change, I think, is the velocity is going to be very, very challenging. But on the other side of it, and sort of, part of my mission with Superintelligent is seeing how fast we can get to the other side of this chasm. I think there's going to be more, not less opportunities. So they'll just look really different, I think, in some ways than the ones that we have today.
Yeah. Well, I like that. That feels hopeful and expansive and optimistic instead of what I think so many creatives listen to, which is more of the doomsday perspective on this. So thank you for sharing that. And then as we wrap up this really rich, interesting, diverse conversation, is there anything that feels important to speak about regarding this topic, this intersection of creativity, of entrepreneurship, and of technology that we haven't already touched on?
No, I mean, I will just double click on this AI thing. I think I really am convinced that the opportunity for it to be great is so immense. And again, that does not mean that I think that people should not advocate for their rights or have conversations about business ethics in this new area. But I think it would be a mistake to not have those conversations while at the same time, like experimenting, hacking at these things, figuring out like the future is being revealed to us. And it's once again a moment where someone's going to create it, and I think, going back to your sort of this idea of building an intentional life, building an intentional career, the moment, the opportunity set for that has so dramatically expanded in the last 2 years because of this in a way that is very hard to articulate, honestly. And so I hope people, if I could have one wish, it would be to channel as much of that fear, anxiety, trepidation into experimentation. I think that
Yes.
oftentimes the best answer to anxiety is to do a thing, do something, and just start and sort of, plow through it. Like,
Yeah.
anxiety and fear and worry thrive on idleness. And that doesn't mean, sort of, again, race at stupid things. They can call you up to get coaching on that. But people, there's going to be so many interesting things created over the next couple of years, before everyone figures this stuff out. So it's going to be a really fun time. It's the most exciting professional time that I've ever had in, 20 plus years. So I hope other people get to experience it too.
So if somebody does want to experiment, where should we send them, Nathaniel?
BeSuper.ai. That's the big thing these days. And I'm NLW on every network, so I'm always easy to find. It's just me and the National Library of Wales competing for that handle. But
My money's on you.
BeSuper.ai. Yeah. BeSuper.ai is where you can find all this instantiation of all the stuff that I've been talking about.
Wonderful. We'll put all of that in the show notes. So I just have one last question for you.
You bet.
Off topic, but also you have the opportunity for a dream dinner party. You can invite anybody, up to 5 people, dead or alive. Who's at your dinner party?
Man, they're all dead. So sorry, all living people.
That's what I figured.
Sorry, all living people. I'm related to John Adams, so he's coming. And I feel a very intense kinship when I read about him, like running around the Constitutional Congress, basically doing everyone else's work, whether they wanted him to or not. So he's on there. Who else? I don't know. It would change moment to moment, I think. I don't know. It's like what would I want to talk about right now? And there's so much political conversation that I just keep gravitating towards politicians. There's these two guys, Thomas Clarkson and Wilberforce, who were sort of this very interesting pair, who were instrumental in the British abolitionist movement. And they were sort of this outsider and this insider who came together to, Britain was the British abolitionist movement was the first time that people advocated for a group outside of themselves in history, that had never happened before in that way. So I think that's a pretty instrumental moment, and it'd be interesting to talk to them. But I don't know, Dickens is my favorite. Christmas Carol is my favorite story. Dickens is my favorite author. So so I don't know, old very crusty white dudes, I guess. It would be we'd be eating like roast chicken and mashed potatoes and
Yeah.
and having not that much fun. I don't know. Ask me again when I have more time to think about it.
Great. So the final closing question I ask everybody this on the podcast is, if you had an opportunity to speak to your younger self and offer some words of wisdom, what would you offer?
I think it'd be less big and profound and be much more practical. And I think it'd be spend more time around people who are doing the thing rather than trying to do the thing yourself right away. I don't know if I probably wouldn't listen to myself. If I had a time machine, I'd completely ignore myself from the
The old
future.
white guys,
Yeah,
crusty old white
be like,
guys.
shut the fuck up. I'm trying to figure this out for myself, which is exactly the point. But yeah, I don't know. I think that it's the thing that I did the least of that I think is the most valuable. That I think would have maybe taken a full decade or so off of a lot of like sort of patterns of learning that I had to go through.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, for being so generous with your time, your knowledge, your expertise, your just the way that you articulate the so many of the experiences that we know, but we struggle to really see holistically. You have such a gift for that, and I deeply appreciate you taking the time and giving so much energy for this conversation.
Love being here. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then check out my latest episodes right here. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, I would so appreciate if you took a moment to leave me a review. Don't forget to add your favorite takeaway from the episode. See you next time.